Welcome to another video. This one is going to be about how to design coaching processes. A coaching process is a series of steps you take in order to achieve a goal. The goal might be to anti-strat the opponent, to teach the players new strategies, to discover new strategies, to establish new processes, to make work more efficient, more structured. It can be anything basically. But the definition of a process is that it's a series of steps basically. For an example, in a large process, a workflow might be a large process. It can be something that includes many other things that can be split individually. For an example, if you imagine that we have something called a theory session. A theory session might be where you dedicate time, for example 1 or 2 hours, like a scrim, but where you watch match vods, you watch scrim vods, you go through strategies, you anti-strat, you discover new strategies, you revise old strategies and so on. And these things can be split into something called sub-processes, which is individual smaller processes that makes it easier to focus on specific things and improving specific things without having to improve everything else or focusing on everything else at the same time. Within every process or sub-process, we have something called activities. Watching a VOD is an activity, for example. And coaches from all days of Overwatch would know that, or they usually know that other coaches don't or might not think the same way as they do, because back then you would have one coach per team. So when you would be a coach then in a team, you would develop your own tools, your own way of doing things, and then if you bring in a new coach, you might struggle with working 100% efficiently together because you might have different understandings of doing something. And that's why we can think of these activities as, we can split them up in tasks basically, where we write out detailed step-by-step descriptions, not instructions, but descriptions for executing an activity. For example, the way we want to make strats, the way we want to look at old strats, the way we want to measure performance and so on. Those are detailed step-by-step descriptions we can make in order for, as head coaches, I mean, this is usually what the head coach would make, but let's take that later. The good thing about thinking about the execution of an activity as a task and making descriptions like these is because if we bring in an assistant coach, or we are an assistant coach and we go into another team, we can easily be integrated by seeing or being told how to do something in the way it's supposed to be, and we can sort of produce the results that would be appropriate and suitable for the rest of the coaches to use or work with. For example, if we have worked with only one team before and we were the only coach there, we know how the players back there would think and speak about strategies and so on. It doesn't mean that any future team would be the same way with the players. So we have to be, when we enter a new team, if we don't get any tasks, for example, we don't really know how to execute something, and it has to be through trial and error, and it might be a rough process for many people. So by setting up tasks, we can avoid that essentially. But anyways, this video is about designing processes fully, not only designing tasks. So there's a couple of major steps in designing processes. There's the first step, which is defining the coaching staff's goals. What's the vision for the staff? What do they want to achieve? What do we not want to achieve, and so on? And the importance of doing that is because each staff is unique, and if you have a roster that can complement in some ways, for example, if a roster is more self-sufficient, that opens doors to focus on other things. Maybe the players handle strategies more. The staff can focus on areas that don't involve as much strategies. If the players require more strategy, the staff can focus on more strategy, etc. It's up to the head coach to define these goals, because they are the ones that are in this leadership position and have the power to change and mold the team as they think should be done. The second step is identifying the operation conditions. We gotta research how the assistant coaches look at the processes, how they understand it, or how they understand our idea, how they think they would use it, and so on. And it's because the head coach will always know what their intentions was or were. And it doesn't mean that a process will be used the correct way. It might be misused. And that's the reason for why we see head coaches split the tasks basically between assistant coaches, and the head coach then takes more of a overall approach role where they supervise everything that's going on, rather than being in charge of one task or one activity, and the assistant coach does another activity. Because if the head coach is too focused on one activity, they might miss what's happening on the sidelines. And if they miss that, they might miss errors, they might miss failures, they might miss their own mistakes, you name it, basically. So if they delegate and then supervise, or not supervise, but observe is a much better word, they can make adjustments on the fly and they can adapt their workflow, basically. The third step in designing coaching processes is selecting a general approach for design. Each coaching staff is unique, as I mentioned, means that the design process has to be, or the design approach has to be chosen accordingly to what will make the staff the most efficient. For example, if we want to select a design approach for a process where we want to create anti-strategies, and the person who is going to be in charge of that process might be an assistant coach, only one person. Let's say that we won't have more staffs added. We gotta then think about how frequently can the anti-strat be produced, to what degree is the quality produced, how will it be implemented in practice, and so on. And we gotta think about all these things before we actually start doing the anti-strategy. The fourth step is define the features of the goals of the process. Define the features and goals of the process. And this is the macro stuff. What type of properties, what type of attributes, and for example, what's required of the staff to deliver something, what's needed to reach expected results. For example, if we're playing a strategy, we plan for a match, and it requires a process feature where the players practice it, then we have to think about the methods, the people, the training, what enables that feature, what enables the players to practice something. And in this case, it would be teaching them something. The fifth one is define the details of the features and goals of a process. And this is the micro stuff that one or two coaches are usually responsible for. For example, it can be the workflow for players is one large process, and scrims is a sub-process. Usually one or two coaches is in charge of the scrim process, or the scrims, because if you get stuck with everyone in the scrim, every coach attending the scrim, it might end up with only one coach speaking and the rest basically becoming spectators. And you want to spread the work efficiently. You want to spread it so that you don't get delayed on VOD reviews. You don't want to get delayed on scouting the enemy and so on. That's also why, for example, scheduling scrims is usually done by one person, and not everyone in a team. Even when the teams don't have coaches, usually it's one person booking scrims, because players really early on realize that it's a mess if many people book at once, or try to book scrims, because it might be hard to organize who talks with who, when did they talk with each other, did we cancel, did we not cancel, all that stuff. Next step is accounting for errors. It can be when designing a process and we don't think about the human errors, we don't think about how to work around them or how to work with them. For example, if we're practicing in scrims, players tilt, coaches can be distracted, players might not cooperate with each other. How do we predict it? How do we solve it? Why can we not solve it? When can we not solve it? All this stuff. Second example is a coach that lacks the required skills to do something. It can be data analysis, for example. We notice that, or let's say that we want to do a data analysis and we're confident in it, but then we realize that it's too much information or too little time, or we're not skilled enough basically. And we got to give up the task, and it affects the way we structure the work related to that, or maybe something is dependent on the data analysis. We gotta predict that as well. We gotta have some way to check if someone is capable of doing something. Third and last example might be bad decisions due to lack of feedback. It can be when we wanna make strats. Let's say we involve everyone making strats and no one talks. No one helps answering questions. Let's say a DPS asks, what should I do when I play Tracer? I want to play dive with I want to play Tracer when you play dive and we're attacking Hanamura first point. If everyone is quiet, then the Tracer doesn't get any feedback and they might make bad decisions because they gotta guess essentially. Next step after that is optimizing the features and goals. So when we know the possible errors and we've found ways to reduce them, we can optimize the process accordingly. Means that when we know how to predict if players get tilted before it actually makes the scrims bad and we gotta cancel the scrims, we can find some way of talking with them, some way of sorting it out before it actually gets to the bad point. And once we know that, we put it into our scrim process, we adapt the way we work, and we leave doors open for a solution like that. Last step, or not last step, but last step of the design process is ensure that a process is capable of being put in place. You make sure that it's able to meet its goals before you actually start it. So if you have a process where you wanna create strategies without taking input from players for whatever reason, the actual meaning isn't important right now. But let's say that we want to do that. We can't wait with testing the process until a match is about to come or something. We gotta test it before we start introducing it to players. We gotta pretend that we have a match. We gotta set out some deadline or something fake or some imaginary deadline, and we gotta test the process and see how likely is it that we can make this work. How likely is it that this is gonna help us? And it will act as a final test essentially. Once all of these things are defined and designed, planned and defined, we can create a final design. So if you imagine what I went through up to this point, that's basically like a draft in an article. Now we want to do the final draft, and it's checking who is responsible for doing it. How are the tasks supposed to be completed? What are the inputs of the process? Basically, what information do we need? What do we take in? What feedback do players give us? What feedback do other coaches give us? Then we gotta think about the outputs. What do we produce? What feedback do we give? How do we express it and all that stuff? Then we gotta think about the problems that may arise during operations and how to deal with them. We gotta think about the specifics of what equipment, what material and so on to use. We gotta think about the information that's used by a task. If we have VOD sessions and we want to review VODs, we gotta have some information about the VODs. That requires us to have VODs itself. Like we gotta upload them somewhere, we gotta record them and so on. And then information generated by the task. What does a VOD session produce? How do we structure it? How do we present it? All that. And lastly, training and standard procedures when you execute something. For example, if you look at scrims, you don't want players to eat during scrims. You don't want them to alt tab maybe. You don't want players to play with music. All these things is considered standard procedures during operations. And then you gotta think about how you want to train that. And one good way of training that is positive reinforcement. That's basically it. That's how you design a coaching process, more like theoretically. But to sum it all up, it's planning, it's defining, and it's thinking about everything.